What is the Glen Canyon Institute?
Glen Canyon Institute is a nonprofit organization with the mission of restoring a free-flowing Colorado River through Glen Canyon and Grand Canyon.
Okay. And where are you located right now?
We're based out of Salt Lake City.
In Salt Lake City. Okay. So tell me, what loaded question first up. Tell me what the problems we're seeing, in as short of an answer as you can. What is the major problem we're seeing in terms of getting water to the people who need it down the Colorado River?
Well, the big problem with the Colorado River is an issue of supply and demand, to put it simply. There's just not enough water in the system to meet the demands that are put on the river. So a lot of stakeholders in the Colorado River Basin are now taking a very hard look at how we're going to manage the river going forward. A lot of people are rethinking old ideas, old foundations of management, and kind of opening their minds to what the realities of this river are going to look like.
What are some of those ideas?
Well, the idea that we've talked about for the last 20 years is the idea of moving water out of Lake Powell and storing it in Lake Mead First. We call it the Fill Mead First proposal. When Glen Canyon Dam was built, it was considered to be one of our country's greatest environmental mistakes. Glen Canyon was the heart and soul of the Colorado River as far as its ecosystem, a very significant place to a number of Native American tribes. It was the confluence of a number of rivers and streams, and it was considered to be as beautiful as the Grand Canyon. So, Glen Canyon was this focal point for American environmentalism. Now, we don't have enough water in the system to keep Lake Powell and Lake Mead full. So what we're saying is, if we can't fill both of these reservoirs, not even close, why don't we move that water down to Lake Mead and let Glen Canyon, America's lost national park, why don't we let that come back to life? If we were to, just real quick, if we were to completely move the water out of Lake Powell into Lake Mead today, Lake Mead would only be 70% full. So that just gives you an idea of how much water is actually in these reservoirs right now.
So, one of the things that water folks I mean, very generally, people, when we talk about Lake Mead and sort of the downfall of the water issues in Vegas, there are sort of two things that people talk about. One is the amount of water that Vegas is actually using, which I'll ask you about in a second. But two is the advent of the dam in Lake Powell. And, though Lake Mead hit records in the 80s, after Lake Powell was built, a lot of the issues with Lake Mead started after the advent of Lake Powell. So would you agree that sort of the dam in Lake Powell are a clog in that Colorado River system?
I would say so. And, look, the question today isn't, should we drain Lake Powell? The question today is, are we going to accept the reality that Lake Powell is going away? And are we going to start taking steps to better manage Glen Canyon and the Colorado River system around Glen Canyon and Lake Mead? That's the reality. As you mentioned, Lake Mead's about to hit its lowest point in history. In the next year, Lake Powell is going to reach its lowest point since it began filling in the 1960s. And while it sounds shocking, none of this came as a surprise to us or any of the other people working on the Colorado River. This has been projected for over 10 years. I mean, scientists and, academics, policy people who are paying attention, we've all been predicting this moment for a long time. And now that it's finally here, we're saying, it's really time to take a hard look at how these reservoirs are managed and really assess this idea of moving that water downstream, because the purpose of Glen Canyon Dam is to store excess water for the upper basin states. But now that we don't have any excess water in the system, it doesn't make sense to hang on to this dwindling reservoir. We can move that upper basin water, put it in Lake Mead, and just count it for the upper basin. It's an accounting issue.
One of the things that we hear a lot about in terms of the water going into Lake Mead is obviously snowpack and you know, drought and precipitation and all that stuff. But if you could talk about how Lake Powell is drying up, not just because of the release of water, but also evaporation and the difference in, I believe there's a difference in rocks that plays an issue here.
Yeah, so reservoirs by their nature are inefficient. They lose water to evaporation, surface evaporation. They lose water to seepage. And when you look at Lake Powell versus Lake Mead, it turns out that Lake Powell is a less efficient reservoir. So the best data that's out now suggests that if you were to combine the storage in Lake Mead and Fill Mead First, you would increase the system efficiency a bit. You would reduce some of that surface area. You would reduce the surface evaporation, and you'd reduce seepage. So the best numbers that we have right now suggest that Fill Mead First could save anywhere from 30,000 to 50,000 acre feet a year.
And is there any data to show how much we're losing from evaporation?
It's a very tricky number to calculate. The figures for evaporation loss at Lake Powell haven't been updated since the 1970s, so we don't have great data on that. In Lake Mead, the numbers are they're more updated. I don't know the exact figure, but the rough calculation that water managers use is that when Powell and Mead are full, they lose about 1 million acre feet to evaporation every year when they're full. And when they're half full or less, you could project that it's about half that amount or less.
Right. So with this plan, if we're talking about water going downriver to Nevada, which would then better, which would better affect Nevada and California versus Utah and Arizona, is there any pushback from those upper states?
Absolutely, there is pushback against this idea. And it's sort of this symbolic line, right? The Glen Canyon Dam is the dividing line of the upper basin and the lower basin. And when when the water is released downstream right now, that's sort of the delivery point of the upper basin delivering its water to the lower basin. So this idea of the upper basin states storing water downstream in Lake Mead, while physically it's very easy to conceive of, there's a big political boundary there that's hard for policymakers to wrap their heads around. So if the upper basin were to store water in Lake Mead, it would need to be a protected pool, if you will. That's kind of the way that it's talked about. It would be looked at as a kind of intentionally created surplus in Lake Mead that counts as upper basin delivered water. Because for all intents and purposes, Lake Powell is already a lower basin reservoir, right? By the time the water gets there, none of the upper basin states can use it anyway. So effectively, it's already downstream. So it's an accounting issue of how do you put that water down there and then count it for the upper basin states, so they're given credit for that water.
Right. When you talk to those policy leaders, both in upper basin and lower basin, what's their reaction to this idea?
It's outside of the box enough that I don't think policymakers are ready to entertain this idea seriously, but the scientists and some of the people that are tasked with studying management of the river, they are starting to look at it seriously. And the reason we're starting to look at it seriously is because they don't have a choice. And I think that's the reality of this conversation, is that at a certain point, it just won't make sense to hang on to Lake Powell anymore. It'll make more sense to put that water down in Lake Mead. And the question is, what is the elevation of Powell and Mead where it makes most sense for policymakers? So right now, the Bureau of Reclamation is projecting that by next year, Lake Powell could get down to within 3,525 feet, which is near the lower elevation balancing tier. And that's just a stone's throw away from the minimum power pool. So minimum power pool, once Lake Powell goes below that level, Glen Canyon Dam is no longer generating electricity. And Lake Powell reaching minimum power pool within the next few years is very much within the realm of possibility. And once it goes below that level, it becomes a lot harder to manage the reservoir, and the kind of benefits of having the reservoir at all really start to go away. And at that point, it really starts to make sense to look at the full draining of Lake Powell and putting the water in Lake Mead. And at that point, you keep the dam in place. You use Glen Canyon Dam as a backup reservoir if wetter conditions return.
What would happen in terms of power generation if that happened?
Once Lake Powell goes below minimum power pool, there is no power generation at the at Glen Canyon Dam. So that obviously creates a lot of challenges. It wouldn't stop. It wouldn't cause blackouts, right? This wouldn't like destroy the electrical grid. There are plenty of other electrical sources on the grid that could meet that demand, but it would be a big shift in where some electric suppliers get electricity from. We actually had a study done a few years ago to see what that impact would be to ratepayers. And if Glen Canyon Dam were to go offline, the average impact to end users, so people like you and me, would probably be an increase of 8 cents per month in the electrical bill.
When you talk about this with stakeholders in Nevada, whether it's politicians or the Bureau or whoever, or the reclamation, it seems the argument seems to be, well, Lake Powell should have never been constructed, and we should hold the water in this other reservoir that's only a third full. And when you pitch that, I'm sure people in Nevada love it, but what do they say to you? Like, let's get this going. What's the reaction?
The position of most stakeholders right now is to not rock the boat if it's not necessary. So, at this point, no major stakeholders are saying, let's go Fill Mead first. But I think behind closed doors, more and more of them are starting to seriously consider the idea. And, in the upper basin, we live in a little bit of a different reality. You guys down in Las Vegas have taken some very serious conservation measures. California, Nevada, Arizona, all those states are proactively curtailing their use already. In the upper basin states, like Utah, for example, the state of Utah right now is doing everything it can to build a new pipeline to suck new water out of the Colorado River. So while the lower basin states are proactively planning for drought, the upper basin states are trying to use more water.
A lot of sprinklers going off there in Salt Lake City.
Most of the water goes to agriculture, and that's the big picture here. But there's a lot of diversity of interests when you're looking at stakeholders in the Colorado River Basin. And our position is, at a certain point, it's just not going to make sense to hang on to Lake Powell anymore. And meanwhile, Glen Canyon, which is this incredible place, right? It was as beautiful as the Grand Canyon. It's geographically, it's sandwiched between Canyonlands National Park and Grand Canyon National Park. It's got Bears Ears National Monument to the east and Grand Staircase National Monument to the west. Glen Canyon is the heart and soul of the Colorado River, and so much of it is coming back to life. Almost 100,000 acres of land are now out of water. We have over hundreds of miles of newly flowing rivers, tributaries, creeks, streams. We're seeing waterfalls come back. We're seeing arches come back, natural bridges. The wildlife is returning. The plant life is returning. There is a massive ecological restoration happening in Glen Canyon right now. And that needs to be taken into account when we're talking about how to manage the Colorado River.
One thing that we talk about a lot about Lake Mead is the lower it gets, the worse it gets for recreation and tourism. And there are towns along Lake Mead that rely on boating and recreation and stuff like that, and have had to evolve because the water isn't there anymore. Is it sort of the reverse at Lake Powell? I mean, I assume there has to be some sort of recreation on the lake that people wouldn't want it to get any lower, or am I wrong?
No, that's right. There's still a lot of reservoir recreation going on at Lake Powell, and I'm not trying to look down on people who like to do that, because I have family and friends. I'm a Utah guy, and people love Lake Powell, and I totally understand it. But as this reservoir draws down as a result of this supply and demand imbalance, the recreation that's going to be happening in the canyon is going to transition to more backcountry or national park style recreation. If and when Lake Powell fully goes away, the recreation there would resemble something more like a national park, like Zion in Utah or Canyonlands National Park, where you have, river rafting, backpacking, hiking, some of the, kind of like you see around Page, Arizona, with the Overlook or the Antelope Canyon hiking tours. The recreation picture is going to change a lot,
Right.
whether or not people want it to.
Right, right. But also you're saying that by going back to the original sort of landscape, that's sort of an even better way to recreate and draws people in.
Oh yeah, I mean the restoration happening in Glen Canyon is gonna be it collectively it would be the biggest river restoration site in the world, and there's nowhere else like it, and we're already seeing it happen on the main stem of the Colorado River as it enters what used to be Lake Powell. There's now 40 miles of free flowing Colorado River, so we're seeing whitewater rapids come back. We're seeing the sediment get washed away up there. It's a completely evolving resource, and it's a very important resource to river runners and backpackers and just a different set of recreationists.
Right. So lastly I'll ask you sort of what I asked you at the beginning, and I see the picture behind you, and when you sort of look at Lake Powell, it doesn't really look like a lake. It looks like a snake on top of another snake that they decided to clog up and build a river, build a reservoir. It doesn't really look like a reservoir. You had mentioned that this was a flawed project from the beginning. Can you talk about what makes it flawed? Is it something in the design? Is it something in how it functions? What makes this bad?
When Glen Canyon Dam was commissioned in 1956, there were no environmental laws in the United States. There was no Endangered Species Act. There was no NEPA. There were no studies that had to be done. There was no assessment of what the impact to the environment would be. It wasn't part of the American ethos yet, right? It was after Glen Canyon Dam was built is when the modern environmental movement really started in the US. So nobody looked at Glen Canyon and asked the question of what would be the impact to the native fish species? What would be the impact to the wildlife? And more broadly, is it worth it to drown, one of the most incredible canyons in the world? You got to remember at that time, the Bureau of Reclamation wanted to build dams in the Grand Canyon. And if you propose that today, people would laugh at your face because the Grand Canyon is such an important resource as a free flowing river in a canyon. And the same should be said for Glen Canyon upstream, right? It was just not something that was looked at when the dam was built originally.
But is there something about its design, or I always thought, when I got here, people were like, oh, Lake Powell evaporates and it's a huge issue. And, I sort of look at the picture behind you and it's like, oh, because the surface area is sort of all over the place. Am I completely wrong in thinking that has anything to do with it? Because I thought I was super smart.
No, you're not wrong. I mean, look, all dams are flawed. All dams are temporary. All dams will eventually fill up with sediment. The Colorado River is one of the most sediment-filled rivers, and depending on who you ask, that reservoir behind me would fill up with sediment regardless of its drawdown. So all dams and reservoirs have their own flaws, but I think the biggest flaw of Glen Canyon Dam is that it drowned one of the most amazing places on the planet.
All right. Anything else I didn't ask you?
Well, I just can't emphasize enough the ecological rebound that's happening in this canyon. It's truly amazing. If you ever want to go see it, I'd be happy to take you out there and show you some of the waterfalls and arches that are coming back and see the wildlife and plant life.